A priest is a spiritual captain, a kind of prophet, a guider of the people in their worship, the guide heavenward, the enlightener of daily life. This is how Carlyle describes the iteration of the hero as priest. He is referring to Luther and Knox specifically, noting that they are better described here as reformers rather than mere priests. For the purposes of this video, we shall be looking at what Carlyle had to say about Martin Luther, the hero as priest and reformer. Carlyle notes that there have been other notable priests that have fulfilled their duties in times of peace, faithfully guiding their flock under the guidance of God. He contrasts this, however, with the priest in the time of distress and danger. He says, quote, "The spiritual captain who led through that becomes, especially to us who live under the fruit of his leading, more notable than any other. He is the warfaring and battling priest, who led his people not to quiet faithful labor as in smooth times, but to faithful valorous conduct in times all violent, dismembered, a more perilous service, and a more memorable one, be it higher or not." End quote. This is an excellent point here, as Carlyle goes beyond the simple inference that one can draw between peacetime and wartime actions, that actions in peacetime are easier than wartime actions. It is the priest in wartime that, by the grace of God and his power, keeps the flock of the faithful from being rent asunder. Without the priest in the time of war, the flock is left open to all forms of spiritual and subversive attacks, and it is because of this nature of spiritual war that the priest is at war more often than the rest of the population. While it is true that the priest does play a very key role in physical warfare, it is their role in spiritual warfare that often goes unremembered. Spiritual warfare is not as flashy or dramatized, and it has become so common to us that it no longer carries with it any amount of fright or dread. Nonetheless, it is in this hidden field of war where we need the hero as priest now more than ever. Our enemies have engaged us in that field, and the amount of spiritual captains afforded to us currently is severely lacking. Hence we have seen the West fall to hedonism and all manner of apostasy. This becomes clearer when Carlyle writes, quote, "If we add now the melancholy fact that when belief waxes uncertain, practice too becomes unsound, and errors, injustices, and miseries everywhere more and more prevail." We will come back to this quote, but it is because of the lack of guidance from priestly heroes that we are in our current state. Carlyle then goes on to describe the hero as priest, as a reformer. Quote, "The mild shining of the poet's light has to give place to the fierce lightning of the reformer. Unfortunately, the reformer, too, is a personage that cannot fail in history. The poet, indeed, with his mildness, what is he but the product of the ultimate adjustment of reform, or prophecy, with its fierceness?" End quote. Here we see the reformer, a specific iteration of the hero as priest, allows for the later, equally as vital heroes for us that value civilization. For what is a civilization without its poetry and artwork? And, as Carlyle has pointed out, what is the poet without the reformer to set the stage for him, carrying on the light that was once seen in the lightning now past? The reforms brought about by the reformer, although being met with great opposition, are also just as necessary. Carlyle writes, quote, "Alas, the battling reformer too is, from time to time, a needful and inevitable phenomenon. Obstructions are never wanting. The very things that were once indispensable furtherances became obstructions, and need to be shaken off and left behind us. A business often of enormous difficulty." End quote. This may, at first, sound like progressivism, as it may look like Carlyle is here suggesting that we naturally move on from past mechanisms and natural progress. But one only reaches this conclusion by disregarding how Carlyle saw human nature and institutions. It is not because we have become better that we move on from past mechanisms, but it is rather because we, sinful, pitiful humans, corrupt and bloat our good institutions to the point where parts of them must be torn down and replaced by something uncorrupted. In this view, humanity can be described not as a cycle or a line, but as a wave, with golden ages filled with men of great inspiration, and with ages of decadence and degeneration marked by bloated institutions, both spiritually and structurally in need of reform. Carlyle goes on to write against a linear view of history, saying, quote, "Why could not Dante's Catholicism continue, but Luther's Protestantism must needs follow? Alas, nothing will continue. I do not make much of progress of the species, as handled in these times of ours." End quote. He also writes, in the full passage from earlier, quote, "Practice too becomes unsound, and errors, injustices, and miseries everywhere more and more prevail. We shall see material enough for revolution. At all turns, a man who will do faithfully needs to believe firmly. If he cannot dispense with the world's suffrage and make his own suffrage serve, the work committed to him will be misdone. Every such man is a daily contributor to the inevitable downfall." End quote. It is in this quote that we get a summary of Carlyle's view of history, as well as a subtle underscore for the importance of the priest and reformer. It is the priest, and in times of spiritual strife, the reformer, that keeps men believing firmly so that they can act faithfully. Inversely, if there is no priests, or, in times of spiritual strife, reformers, then there is no guide and inspiration for men to believe firmly, and as such, these men will bring about the downfall of our institutions first and our civilization second. Carlyle describes how this happens. Quote, "Offenses accumulate till they become insupportable, and are then violently burst through, cleared off as by explosion. Dante's sublime Catholicism, incredible now in theory, and defaced still worse by faithless, doubting, and dishonest practice, has to be torn asunder by a Luther." End quote. And it is here that we can start properly displaying Luther as the hero, as priest and reformer. Carlyle begins by noting that every hero as prophet has great zeal against the evil of idolatry, but Carlyle then gives his own definition and application of idolatry. He says that idols are eidolon, a thing seen, a symbol, and then goes on to say that all worship is preceded by things seen, by symbols, by idols. He says, quote, "The most rigorous Puritan has his confession of faith and intellectual representation of divine things, and worships thereby. Thereby is worship first made possible for him." End quote. I would like to stop here to interject. It is important to note that Carlyle deviates from Christendom's understanding of idolatry. Under Carlyle's very broad definition, he is correct, but only in that broad definition. Christendom understands idols as anything worshipped instead of God. Here, the two definitions part ways, and we can understand that the Puritan worships by his confession by Scripture, but he does not necessarily worship the actual confession itself. And it is this important distinction, the Christian perspective of idolatry and Carlyle's new definition, that should be kept in mind. So, if Carlyle does not see idols as intrinsically evil, how does he explain the actions of the prophets and the reformers? Carlyle writes, quote, "The rudest heathen that worshipped Canopus or the Kaaba Blackstone, he, as we saw, was superior to the horse that worshipped nothing at all. Nay, there was a kind of lasting merit in that poor act of his, analogous to what is still meritorious in poets, recognition of a certain endless divine beauty and significance in stars and all natural objects whatsoever." End quote. This may seem like a defense of those that worship idols, but he continues, saying, quote, "But here enters the fatal circumstance of idolatry, that, in the era of the prophets, no man's mind is any longer honestly filled with his idol or symbol. Before the prophet can arise who, seeing through it, knows it to be mere wood, many men must have begun dimly to doubt that it was little more. Condemnable idolatry is insincere idolatry." End quote. And this is where we are today. If you have listened to my series on the Zoomers, you may recall that one of my issues is that the Zoomers simply don't believe anything at all. Their hearts are mere vacuums, with no strong convictions in any direction. With this quote, we see that Carlyle recognized the generational faithlessness as a pattern that gives rise to the heroes as prophet. And it is here that we can in particular see Luther battling at first with the Roman Church over the issues of indulgences. Carlyle especially rings true here. To Luther, the indulgences being sold off by the Roman Church were worse than just pieces of paper or sheepskin. They were actively harmful to the conscience of a Christian. Philip Melanchthon, summarizing Luther's objections, writes of indulgences in the Apology to the Augsburg Confession, quote, "For the great fraud of indulgences, etc., and the preposterous doctrines of the sophists have sufficiently taught us what great vexation and danger arise therefrom, if a foul stroke is here made. How many a godly conscience under the papacy sought with great labor the true way, and in midst of such darkness did not find it." End quote. In fact, it was the topic of indulgences that prompted Luther to first write his 95 Theses. Even less talked about, though, is the fact that they galvanized the reformer to such a degree that he went farther with his works than he originally anticipated. And now, the 95 Theses are not considered properly Lutheran by any Lutheran churches. That is, the 95 Theses were written as a defense of the Roman Catholic Church against the peddlers of indulgences in Germany. It is because of this that I would say that Carlyle understates the extent of which idolatry will fuel a reformer. Carlyle then goes on to explain how Protestantism fits into European history, and he specifically counters the Roman claim that Protestantism introduced new evils into the world. Carlyle writes, quote, "There is nothing generically new or peculiar in the Reformation. It was a return to truth and reality in opposition to falsehood and semblance, as all kinds of improvement and genuine teaching are and have been. Liberty of private judgment, if we will consider it, must at all times have existed in the world. Dante had not put out his eyes or tied shackles on himself. He was at home in that Catholicism of his, a free-seeking soul in it. If many a poor Hogstraten, Tetzel, and Dr. Eck had now become slaves in it. Liberty of judgment? No iron chain or outward force of any kind could ever compel the soul of a man to believe or disbelieve. It is his own indefeasible light, that judgment of his. He will reign and believe there by the grace of God alone. The sorriest sophistical Bellarmine, preaching sightless faith and passive obedience, must first, by some kind of conviction, have abdicated his right to be convinced. His private judgment indicated that, as the advisablest step he could take, the right of private judgment will subsist in full force wherever true men subsist." End quote. Carlyle continues on Protestantism, saying, quote, "It was no new saying. It was a return to all old sayings that ever had been said. Be genuine, be sincere. That was, once more, the meaning of it. Mahomet believed with his whole mind, Odin with his whole mind, he and all true followers of Odinism. They, by their private judgment, have judged so." End quote. And it is with this that we can see why Carlyle truly admires Luther and his reforms. There is nothing more central to Luther and his writings than the conscience. Luther's most famous quote was uttered at the Diet of Worms, where upon being demanded to recant, he replied, quote, "Here I stand, for I can do no other. God help me. Amen." End quote. In that moment, we see that Luther believed with his whole mind, his conscience, and had not the deceit or weakness of will to betray it. It was this experience and understanding of the conscience that would create the Lutheran doctrine of sola gratia, that man is saved by grace alone and not by works. In conveying Luther's theology on the matter, Philip Melanchthon wrote, quote, If hope would rely upon works, then indeed it would be uncertain, because works cannot pacify the conscience, as has been said above frequently, and this faith makes a distinction between those who obtain salvation and those who do not obtain it." End quote. It is the genuine, sincere faith of the conscience in God that allows a Christian to be assured in his salvation. For those unfamiliar with Lutheranism, it is this point of belief that Christians are saved by grace alone that is the foundation of the Church and Christianity. Carlyle continues the refutation of arguments against Protestantism. This time, he is refuting the idea that private judgment afforded by the Reformation atomizes Christianity into selfish independence. In fact, he asserts the opposite. Carlyle writes, quote, "It is not honest inquiry that makes anarchy, but it is error, insincerity, half-belief, and untruth that make it. A man protesting against error is on the way towards uniting himself with all men that believe in truth. There is no communion possible among men who believe only in hearsays. The heart of each is lying dead, has no power of sympathy even with things, or he would believe them and not the hearsays." End quote. That is, actual spiritual disunity is created by men that can no longer bring themselves to believe, the men that have such a weakness of will that they betray their own conscience. They do this to maintain nominal unity, and in doing so, they sacrifice their souls, conscience, and true spiritual unity. When Carlyle speaks of communion, he is echoing two people. First is St. Paul, who writes to the Corinthians on the subject of communion while divided, beginning with the 19th verse. Quote, "For, in the first place, when you came together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, for in eating each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those that have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not." End quote. This was one of the verses which contributed to the Lutheran view of communion, specifically that there must be no divisions among those that commune. For whoever communes unworthily eats and drinks judgment upon himself. It is here that we see the insidious nature of nominal unity, and how, according to Holy Scripture, it caused spiritual anarchy, and as later recorded by Paul, physical illness and death. This principle of only nominal unity being harmful applies throughout Christianity on every point of doctrine, and it is only through addressing the convictions held by the conscience that true spiritual unity can be derived. Carlyle writes, quote, "Only in a world of sincere men is unity possible, and there, in the long run, it is as good as certain." End quote. Carlyle then goes on to speak of the Reformer as one who deposes false captains of faith, and in doing so, Carlyle redefines the concept of a pope. I make this point to clear up any oncoming confusion. Carlyle is about to speak of a pope meaning only a spiritual captain, and not meaning anything about clarifying doctrine, or being a mediator between God and man, or literally any other connotation. Only a spiritual captain. Carlyle writes of Luther and the Pope, quote, "Man alone can love with right gratitude and genuine loyalty of the soul the hero-teacher who has delivered him out of darkness into light. Is not such a one a true hero and serpent-queller, worthy of all reverence? The black monster, falsehood, our one enemy in this world, lies prostrate by his valor. It was he that conquered the world for us. See, accordingly, was not Luther himself reverenced as a true pope, or spiritual father, being verily such?" End quote. Carlyle continues, quote, "Loyalty and sovereignty are everlasting in the world, and there is this in them, that they are grounded not on garnitures and semblances, but on realties and sincerities. Not by shutting your eyes, your private judgment, no, but by opening them, and by having something to see. Luther's message was deposition and abolition to all false popes and potentates, but life and strength, though afar off, to new genuine ones. End quote. And it is here that we return to one of Carlyle's motifs, that the false captains must be torn down and replaced by true heroes. We are still in an age of false captains, but we are nearing the precipice. A system being led by false captains, men of insincerity and weakness of will, cannot stand, especially when it is pitted against a reformer carrying with him the righteous fury of God. And this sentiment is ultimately what gives Carlyle hope. He writes, quote, "In all this wild revolutionary work, from Protestantism downwards, I see the blessedest result preparing itself. Not abolition of hero worship, but rather what I would call a whole world of heroes. If hero means sincere man, why may not every one of us be a hero? A world all sincere, a believing world, the like has been, the like will again be, cannot help being." End quote. This was the first half of Carlyle's fourth lecture, The Hero as Priest. Perhaps later I will speak on the second half. For now, though, I will end with a summary of Luther from Carlyle that especially captures both Luther and Carlyle's perception of him. Quote, "We are to consider Luther as a prophet idol-breaker, a bringer back of men to reality. It is the function of great men and teachers." Carlyle continues, "Luther said to the Pope, 'This thing of yours that you call a pardon of sins, it is a bit of rag paper with ink. It is nothing else. It, and so much like it, is nothing else. God alone can pardon sins. Popeship, spiritual fatherhood of God's church, is that a vain semblance of cloth and parchment? It is an awful fact. God's church is not a semblance. Heaven and hell are not semblances. I stand on this, since ye drive me to it. Standing on this, I, a poor German monk, am stronger than you all. I stand solitary, friendless, but on God's truth, you with your tiaras, triple hats, with your treasuries and armories, thunders spirituals and temporal, stand on the devil's lie, and are not so strong.